Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story where love is slowly being pulled apart. What would you do if you suddenly realized your family wasn't being protected, but controlled from the inside? Stay with me to find out what happens next. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It built quietly, day by day, layer by layer, until one morning the CEO woke up and realized he hadn't had a single moment to breathe. Work had changed again. At first it was manageable: meetings, reports, decisions, all things he used to handle without thinking. But now there was more expectations, more responsibility, more weight, and all of it came at the same time. Emails didn't stop, calls didn't wait, deadlines didn't move. And slowly, without him noticing, the hours stretched longer, the nights became shorter, and the space he used to hold for Tieu Lac and the baby started to shrink. At home, things were changing too, but in a different way. Not loud, not obvious, just different. Tieu Lac noticed it first, not through big moments, but through small ones. The way the baby wasn't always with her anymore, the way the nurse appeared more often, the way decisions were made without her being part of them. Madam said the baby needs a more stable schedule. The nurse's voice was always polite, always gentle, but the words never came from her. Tieu Lac stood there, watching, as the baby was gently taken from her arms, not roughly, not forcefully, but still taken. "I can take care of her," she said quietly, not arguing, just stating. The nurse smiled. "Of course she did." "I know." A pause. "But this is for her health." There it was again, not a command, not a refusal, but something harder to fight: reason. Tieu Lac didn't push further, not because she agreed, but because she didn't know how to fight something that sounded right. The first argument happened that night. Small, almost unnoticeable, but it mattered. The CEO had just returned, later than usual, tired, distracted, his mind still half inside the office. Tieu Lac was sitting by the window, empty arms. The baby was not there. He noticed immediately. "Where is she?" His voice was calm, but alert. "With the nurse." A pause. "They said she needed to sleep on schedule." Silence, short, but enough. He nodded, as if that made sense, as if that was normal. "Okay, just one word, simple, easy, too easy." Tieu Lac looked at him, her expression shifting. "That's it?" He frowned slightly. "What do you mean? You're okay with that?" Her voice wasn't loud, but there was something under it now, something new, something sharper. He hesitated, not long, but long enough. "They're just trying to help." There it was, the first line drawn, not intentional, not planned, but real. Tieu Lac's fingers tightened slightly. "She's my child." The words came softly, but clearly. "I know," he replied immediately, but his tone didn't match hers. "Then why does it feel like I need permission to be with her?" Silence, the kind that doesn't resolve, because now it wasn't about the baby, it was about something deeper, something neither of them had said out loud yet. "I didn't say that." His voice was firmer now, more controlled, because he didn't understand where this was going. Or maybe he didn't want to. "You didn't have to." Her answer came quickly, too quickly, because it had been building for days. The room grew quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. This one was heavier, unsettled. The argument didn't explode, it didn't escalate, it just stopped, half-finished, unresolved. And somehow, that made it worse. From the hallway, she heard everything. His mother, standing in the same place, watching the same pattern unfold. And this time, there was no doubt. Something had begun. The next few days followed the same rhythm. Work, distance, small changes, more time with the nurse, less time with Tieu Lac, and every time, the explanation was the same. Routine, health, structure. The CEO didn't question it, not deeply, not fully, because in his mind, everything had a reason, everything had logic, and logic was easier to accept than doubt. But Tieu Lac didn't see it that way, because for her, it wasn't about logic, it was about feeling, and something didn't feel right. The second argument came faster, sharper, still small, but clearer. "She cried today," Tieu Lac said quietly. "They didn't let me take her." The CEO looked up from his phone. "Why?" "They said she needed to finish her feeding schedule." A pause. "And I wasn't part of it." Silence. "That doesn't make sense," he said finally, but his voice wasn't strong. "Not enough." "It does to them." Her answer came immediately. "And now it does to you too." There it was again, that distance, that line, becoming clearer. He put the phone down, finally looking at her. "You're overthinking this." Wrong words, wrong moment. Tieu Lac froze, just for a second, because something inside her shifted. "I'm her mother." Her voice dropped, lower now, not louder, but more certain. "And I'm starting to feel like I'm not allowed to be." He stood up, frustration rising now. That's not what's happening. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure, not completely. "Then what is happening?" she asked. And this time, there was no softness left, only truth. He didn't answer, because he didn't have one. Not a real one. The silence returned, but now it wasn't quiet. It was loud, filled with everything they hadn't said. From the shadows, his mother watched again, her expression unchanged. But inside, something moved, slow, satisfied. "Not yet," she murmured softly. "But soon." Back in the room, Tieu Lac turned away, holding on to herself, because something was slipping, not the baby, not yet, but something else, something harder to hold on to. And the CEO stood there, caught between two worlds again, but this time he didn't even realize that he was already drifting. The baby cried softly in the next room, a small sound, fragile, calling, but no one moved immediately, and somewhere in that delay, something broke, just a little, but enough to matter. The question was no longer hidden, no longer subtle, no longer quiet. Was this really about care? Or was this exactly what his mother had planned all along? The shift didn't explode, it tightened, like a thread pulled slowly until you could feel it cutting into everything it held together. The next morning, the house looked the same, clean, ordered, quiet. But underneath, something had changed. The CEO left earlier than usual. A call had come in before sunrise. Urgent, important. Another deal, another problem. Another piece of the company that needed him. Immediately, he paused at the door, just for a second. Looking back, Tieu Lac was awake, sitting on the bed. The baby, not in her arms. Again, their eyes met. No words, because both of them knew if they spoke now, it wouldn't be simple. So he left, and the silence stayed behind. In the hallway, the nurse was already there, waiting. Always waiting. "Madam asked that we begin the new schedule today." The same tone, the same calm, the same quiet authority that didn't belong to her. Tieu Lac stood still, her arms empty, her chest tight. "I want to hold her." A simple request, but it didn't sound like one anymore. It sounded like something else, something she had to ask for. The nurse hesitated, just slightly, then smiled. Of course she did. After feeding time, not a refusal, not exactly, but not yes either. Tieu Lac didn't argue, she didn't shout, she didn't fight, because this house wasn't built for that kind of battle. So she turned away, slowly, quietly. But inside, something was no longer still. Later that day, the CEO didn't return, not at his usual time, not even late, just not at all. The baby cried more that evening, restless, uneasy. The nurse handled it, efficiently, correctly, perfectly. But something was missing. Tieu Lac stood by the doorway, watching, not interfering, because she had learned that stepping in meant stepping out of line. Her hands clenched at her sides, her body still, but her eyes didn't move. Because every instinct in her was telling her something was wrong. Not with the baby, but with everything around her. When the CEO finally returned, it was past midnight. The house was silent. Too silent. He stepped in quietly, expecting calm, expecting rest. But instead, he felt it immediately. The difference. Tieu Lac was awake, sitting by the window again. The same place, the same position, but not the same presence. "You didn't come back." Her voice was soft, but it didn't carry warmth. "Not tonight." "I had work," he replied quickly, too quickly, because he already knew. That wasn't enough. She cried for hours. A pause. I wasn't allowed to hold her. Silence, heavy, immediate. He stepped closer. "What do you mean?" His tone shifted, alert now, but still not fully aware. "They said it wasn't her feeding time." Tieu Lac looked at him, finally, directly. "And you weren't here." There it was. Not blame, not accusation, just truth. But truth was enough. "That doesn't make sense," he said. Again, the same words, but this time they sounded weaker. "It makes sense here." Her answer came immediately. "Everything makes sense, except me." That hit harder than anything else, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, honest, and impossible to ignore. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration building now, not just at her, not just at the situation, but at himself. "I'm trying to fix things." His voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in pressure. "In case you haven't noticed, I didn't ask you to fix everything." Her reply came faster, sharper. "I asked you to be here." Silence, the kind that doesn't fade, because now they were no longer talking about the baby, or the nurse, or the schedule. They were talking about them. "I am here," he said, but even as he spoke, he knew that wasn't entirely true. "You're not." She shook her head slowly. "You're just passing through." That was the moment. The line. The one neither of them meant to cross. But now, it was there. From the hallway, she listened. His mother, still, silent, but no longer waiting, because now, the cracks were visible. The next morning, the house continued as usual. Nothing changed. Everything moved on, as if nothing had happened. But something had. The CEO didn't go straight to work, not this time. Instead, he stopped, watched, observed. For the first time, without assumption, he saw it, the routine, the control, the way decisions were made. Without him, without Tieu Lac, the way the baby was moved, handled, scheduled, like something managed, not something loved. And suddenly, everything clicked. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to feel it, enough to see it. He turned, and there she was. His mother, standing exactly where she always stood. Calm, composed, unmoved. "You've noticed." Her voice was soft, almost approving. He didn't respond, because now, there was nothing left to misunderstand. "You wanted her to stay," she continued, and she did. A pause. "But staying is not the same as belonging." His jaw tightened. "She's her mother." The words came low, controlled, but heavy. "And you are her father," she replied calmly. "Which is why you should understand what's best for her." Silence, but not empty. Not anymore. Because now, it was clear, completely. This wasn't about help. This wasn't about care. This wasn't about adjustment. This was control, slow, quiet, perfectly executed. He stepped forward, closer than before, and for the first time, there was no hesitation. No more. His voice didn't rise, but it didn't move either. His mother tilted her head slightly, curious, interested, because now the real decision had arrived. Back in the room, Tieu Lac held the baby again, finally, but her grip was tighter now, stronger, because she felt it too. The shift, the breaking point. The baby made a small sound. Soft, fragile, still fighting, and now, so were they. The question was no longer hidden, no longer quiet, no longer slow. When control becomes clear, and love is pushed to its limit, what will break first, and what will remain, when everything else is stripped away? As pressure from work increases, the CEO becomes more absent, while his mother quietly tightens control over the baby's care. Tieu Lac finds herself increasingly pushed aside, no longer allowed to comfort or hold her own child freely. Small arguments begin to surface between her and the CEO, not loud but deeply unsettling, revealing a growing emotional distance. What once felt like support now feels like control. As the tension builds, the CEO finally starts to notice the manipulation behind the calm surface. Meanwhile, his mother watches in silence, knowing her plan is unfolding exactly as intended.